Welcome to Pod Talks. Pod Talks is a project of protecting our democracy, where we bring together the best minds in New Jersey and beyond to talk about some of the biggest challenges facing our democracy, our institutions, and our personal freedoms. I'm Sean Spiller, Chair of Protecting Our Democracy. Joining us today is the one and only Reverend Derrick, who is an experienced political consultant, advisor to the state leaders, including Governor Murphy, and more recently, the founder and managing director of I AM, the Interfaith Action Movement. Reverend Green, thank you so much for joining today. I appreciate it. Looking forward to our conversation.
Same here, Sean. Always a pleasure to be with you.
Oh, likewise. And before we begin, I just want to mention to all of our listeners, Reverend Green is the founder and managing director of the Interfaith Action Movement, as I noted, an organization whose mission it is to address the spiritual, social, and economic needs of underserved and marginalized communities throughout the state, nation, and the globe. In 2018, he was appointed as the senior advisor for diversity, faith, urban and regional growth for New Jersey to Governor Murphy. In this role, Reverend Green has advanced policy with a focus on equity. From the independent prosecutor law to the legalization of cannabis, Reverend Green has had his voice in every one of those policy conversations to make sure that equity was always front and center. During COVID, Reverend Green began the group, which is now the Interfaith Action Movement, to ensure that communities across New Jersey were accessing the support that was available and the information that they needed. And as I understand it, I'm sure Reverend you'll tell us, I understand you were meeting, every day with a phone call, checking in, make sure people were doing okay. Reverend Green has decades of political consulting experience in campaigns and elections in New Jersey, as well as nationally and internationally. Both for Governor Murphy's campaigns, Reverend Green led the work to get out the vote in communities of color, delivering nearly 94% of the African-American vote for Governor Phil Murphy in 2017 and 2021. So again, Reverend, welcome and thank you for joining today.
I'll take you around everywhere with me to introduce.
Deal. Sounds good. well, a little bit, we usually love to jump in some of the policy pieces, but quite frankly, talking about you and your story is of interest itself. So why don't you, talk a little bit about how did you get involved in politics and election work and, kind of devoting your career to this work?
True story. My father and mother introduced me to the movement, the work at a very early age, Sean. My grandfather fought in World War I. He was born in 1896, fought in World War I and couldn't wear his uniform in some parts of this country. He was from South Carolina. He was a Geechee man. And my grandmother, my grandfather's name was Frank Green. Grandmother's name was Allie Mae Searles Green. And they had 13 children. And they raised their children. Many of them were veterans, worked hard for this country, loved this country, and instilled and that's on my father's side. And my mother's side, same thing, one of 8 children. And they instilled in them the value of service. Service, family, God, 3 pillars of our family that was passed down to me. And my siblings and cousins. And when I was in Atlanta, Georgia, Sean, my father used to take me to the Dr. King birthday celebration before it was a national holiday. It was a holiday in Atlanta. And my father and I would go together because my father was a teacher, and the schools were closed on that day. And we would go down to the Ebenezer Baptist Church and hear some of the great speakers of our day. And I remember when I was 9 years old, holding my father's hand, this feeling came over me. And later on in life, I realized it was a calling. That God was putting something in my soul, in my spirit, to do the work of civil rights, social justice, economic justice in our community. And he was giving me a vision at an early age. And when God gives you a vision, he gives you provision for that vision. And so at 9 years old, he put that in me, and I began to ask my parents so many questions about the movement, about the struggle for humanity, the struggle to preserve our democracy. Now, I didn't use those words back then, but those were the questions I was asking. Well, why? And my father and mother, particularly my dad, answered every question. And then as I grew older, I began to organize. I organized in high school. I went to a boarding school in Georgia. I was one of very few blacks in that school. It was one of the best experiences of my life. And I realized back then that we have more in common as humans, as human beings. We need the same things. We want the same things, those basic things. I was able to organize people at an early age, even in my high school years. That followed me in college. And in college, I began to organize. I started a big organization that lasted for 20 years. And that spirit of organizing, that ability to organize at an early age has followed me throughout my career. And that's what I am. I'm an organizer. I organize people. My organizational principles, Sean, are educate, organize, mobilize. Educate, organize, mobilize. And that's what we've been able to do for so many years in public policy, which has been a blessing. You mentioned the independent prosecutor bill. You mentioned cannabis, equity and who manages New Jersey, the money in New Jersey, the New Jersey state money that is being managed. Who manages that when it comes to supporting the minimum wage, free community college? It has been my honor and privilege to work for Governor Murphy. And I've taken that work for many years. When I first started working for Senator John Corzine, and when I was over abroad in St. Kitts and Nevis working for Prime Minister Timothy Harris, putting that government together. It has just been an absolute honor, learned a lot, and continuing to learn as well.
Yeah, well, no, listen, being shaped by those experiences, and what a powerful story, and great to hear the educator involvement, teacher involvement there as well myself, and certainly that's a key component in anything, and love that as one of the pillars. It has to be for almost anything we want to do. You mentioned something there that I want to jump to, because you spoke about the impact of you being able to ask questions and hear some of the most powerful speakers of the time. And right now, though, we do sometimes hear people say, wait a minute, houses of worship, they're not places for politics. I'll put that in air quotes. They shouldn't be involved in getting people to vote or all those types of things. What's your response? You obviously lived it as a family experience into that, but what do you say to maybe an outsider or those who are putting that out there in the space that there's supposed to be some separation there?
Coming from the African American tradition, the church, the mosque, those faith institutions, particularly for me as a Christian, the church was the only place that we could really gather, and that's why our services are so long, because we could only gather there when we went to church. And so little things, Sean, like the fact that in churches, we're known for our bulletins. Right? The reason why you had bulletins was because that was a way to get information out, because you could not get information out really any other way besides, later on the black press and the black media outlets. But early on, that was the only way to get information out. So our services are long because that was a way for us only way we could gather like that and strategize. Many of the movements that we see, many of the institutions that we see came out of the church. So for me, the church and public policy was a marriage. It was a marriage for me. Organizing ministers was something that I knew I had to do because back in the day, and we learn, Sean, from the lessons of the past. We learn from our history. When we think about the higher academic institutions that we have in the Black community, they came out of the church. My son is the 2019 graduate of Morehouse College. Morehouse College is a faith-based institution. It came out of the church. Spelman came out of the church. Many of the schools that we know of as Oakwood University, the school that I went to in Alabama, came out of the church. And so the church, in my view, is not just a key ingredient to the implementation of public policy. Rather, it's a foundation of the implementation of public policy. So when I do Souls to the Polls, when you go to the church and the minister, she or he, talks about voting, when she or he, I give you a prime example, Sean, and I mean I get excited when I talk about this because
yeah.
I remember when we had the millionaires tax debate, and I talked to Governor Murphy. I said, Governor, the millionaires tax, that's a spiritual issue. God expects us, those that have, to look out for those that have not. He expects us to do that. And it really bugs me when Christians, I only go from what I am, right? Christians don't practice that. We must look out for those that don't have. It is really the responsibility of in our humanity to do that. And so I took the argument, Sean. I convinced Governor Murphy to take the argument to the church. And on Wednesday night prayer meeting at Church of the Oranges, Seventh-day Adventist Church, Governor Murphy was the speaker. He was the preacher for the night, and the preacher was about the principles behind the millionaire's tax. And what it did was it also made the policy issue around the millionaire's tax. It made people were able to understand it, right? Because he made it clear and simple for them to understand, and that message went out, and soon thereafter, we got the millionaire's tax done.
Yeah, no, that was huge. So, you say something there also in that, people, when they hear of these policy pieces, we're all busy. We've got things going on. We've got our lives. And it's easy to not understand the connection between a policy and its impact on my life or impact on my community or what that's going to be. And it does take, an intentionality to make sure that you help draw those connections, right? And help people. I guess I'd ask you, you mentioned with, Governor Murphy there, and you're certainly proud of the work that you've done and given a great example there. Certainly we see it in the numbers, right? In terms of the voting percentage. For Governor Murphy, I would ask this though. We do still see, right? There's a lagging, right? The whiter community, they tend to turn out more in elections, right? The percentage of individuals who come out to vote are a little bit higher. I think last I saw New Jersey was about 42% of Black voters turn out versus 54% of white voters. Are we just not relating the policies properly in terms of getting the message through, in terms of the impact that these have, in terms of, hey, electing this person versus that person is going to make a huge difference in policy, and that's going to impact you and in all of our communities? Or what's the way we connect with a person to say, no, this is about you, and how do we do that specifically in communities of color?
We have to take government to the people. Sean, most folks, when they get up every day, they are not paying attention to the things that you and I pay attention to every day. They're just not. They're getting up, they're going to jobs. Sometimes they have 2 jobs, 3 jobs. Some job they may not like. Sometimes some jobs they may like. They are living. They're coming home. They're feeding their children. They're helping their kids with their homework. They're trying to get exercise in. Some of them may be single parents. Some of them may be grandparents raising grandchildren. People are trying to live their lives the best way they can. And so oftentimes what we do in government misses them, which is why I'm a big proponent of taking government to the people, because people have to see a tangible result of their vote. And sometimes they don't. And there are attempts to voter suppress by all of the fighting and the us versus them and the me versus you, and the attacks on our democracy. And a lot of people are just tired And that comes across with low vote numbers. The other thing is that there are people who don't understand the political process. I was in Bermuda and doing a campaign over there, and I did a focus group, Sean. And in that focus group, there were members of parliament that were able to hear the responses of the questions, but the people couldn't see them, right? And the members of parliament were shocked that most people did not know what they discussed in parliament. And this is why I told them then, you have to make sure that you take parliament to the people, right? It's not enough to come and look important and go to your office and go to your meetings, and you're talking all in your meetings about issues and policies that impact all these people, but those people know nothing about what you say. And I think that's the disconnect. So we look at our school board numbers, right? The school board election should be some of the highest voting numbers anywhere, not just the president of the country. When we see the highest vote numbers or voting percentages are when the president is elected. Then it comes down a little bit, the governor, right? Then after that is even less participation. By the time you get down to the school board, it's way low, right? People don't need to look at it as what's most important, because that school board election is just as important as that presidential.
Yes, it is.
How your children are educated, the resources and the allocations of dollars to your district, to your neighborhoods. That's extremely important, but folks don't know that. And so if they don't know that, they don't see the direct connection of those elections, Sean, have to their lives.
How do you bring that specific to what you said before, right? Bringing it to the people, using that example, right? How do you're right. People will turn out, they vote for president, and by the time even on that same ballot, they get down to Board of Ed, they don't even vote, right? So how do you bring it to the people, like you said in that example?
Yeah, great question. COVID taught us a lot. COVID taught us that we have to rethink one of the things that Governor Murphy did so well was he put together a think tank of it, and you were a part of it, Sean, the Restart Commission, right? Where people, we knew that we had learned a lot from the pandemic, but we didn't want to just to go back. We wanted to be better, right? Biden called Build Back Better, right? We don't want to just go back. We want to learn from those what sort of was brought to light by the pandemic, right? So what were some of the lessons that we learned during the pandemic? One was that let's take the issue of COVID testing and COVID vaccines. We learned that people had COVID testing hesitancy and also vaccination hesitancy. One, particularly in Black and brown communities. One, because Donald Trump was pushing it, and in the Black community, most folks didn't trust Donald Trump. Bottom line, I'm not being partisan; I'm just being truthful. Mm-hmm. And then the other thing is it's the history of healthcare abuse in the Black community. People talk about the Tuskegee experiment. People talk about things that happened with Johns Hopkins. So in the Black community, what I call it the scuttlebutt, right? The barbershop talk, the beauty salon talk, the church talk. People are saying, I ain't getting that. I'm not getting that. I'm not letting nobody stick anything up my nose, right? What we found was that once you took the vaccinations and testing to spaces where people trust and faces that they trust, then they were able to trust it themselves. I think Mayor Baraka did a great job at that in Newark, and many of the mayors down in around this. In Montclair, the mayors, Sean, you all were amazing, amazing during that time. All around the state, pushing people to get tested and vaccinated. And what we learned was that in some cases, the state even knocked on doors to get people engaged. And what we found was, as you knock on those doors, you also find out other issues that people have. And we were able to solve those issues. So not only did we get people vaccinated, not only did we get people tested, but we found out if there was someone there that was eligible for a free community college. We found that someone there needed help with food, or needed help with training, or was looking for information on business funding, or through the EDA programs, small business grants that were given out during the pandemic. We found all of that out. Why? Because we were at the door, talking to people. And that's what government has to do. One of the people talk about Interfaith Action Movement, which I started in 2020. And at the beginning, it was, people were very fearful, and they said, Reverend Green, we must pray. And I said, absolutely. And God spoke to me. God spoke to David and Dorothy Green's baby boy and said, Reverend Green, I want you to start a prayer call. And I said, God, I will. He didn't say, just start a prayer call. I called a few people. And now, mind you, Sean, we had the Governor's Faith Leaders Roundtable. What was that? That was a venue for faith leaders to impact public policy. And so I had that group, and it was an interfaith group out of the governor's office. So I called a few folks, and they called a few folks. And before we know it, we had 100 people on that prayer call, on a conference call. Try managing that. And people called in every day, every single day. And then someone recommended to me that I start a Zoom, that I turn the conference call into a Zoom call. I had never heard of Zoom. I thought Zoom was a song, and an old song at that, Sean. You're too young for that. But I thought I started a Zoom call, which became a community. And then God said, all right, you have all these people, organize. So the first half was prayer, and the second half was to make sure that the hard to reach communities around the state, because I had everybody on that call, all the leaders on that call, make sure that they had the information that the governor was sharing earlier at his press conferences. Because I knew that some of them were not going to watch the press conferences. So what I did was, the morning after, I'd repeat it. Then I found out, God said, wait a minute, that's working. People are just appreciative. I'll tell you one thing, Sean, that saved lives. When the governor had to make the decision to close churches, I remember that was like a few days before Easter, and we made the decision to close those churches. I'm sorry. It was at the I Am prayer call, Sean, that we got the word out, and that word spread, and and people did not show up at churches, and that saved lives. Yeah. We found in other states that people did go to church, and a lot of those people caught COVID and died. And so we were able to take that call, and guess what, Sean? We still we met this morning. We meet every day. We've been doing it for 3 years. Why? Because it's needed. Yeah. And the people on my call, they are active. They're engaged. And that's how we have to engage communities. It cannot be part-time. It cannot be part-time. It has to be a full-time effort.
Do you think, government, I'll use that in the bigger sense, or, in air quotes, however we want to do it. I remember vividly from the heart of the pandemic. You're right. Especially our health departments going out right into the community, literally knocking on doors, going to apartment complexes, being on site, doing, the work there. Is there a mechanism? Do you think government can build in where, hey, we should be doing call the old like house calls, that they say doctors used to do or whatever, but should there be, rather than organizations having to fill that gap, should there be an arm and people, government, like going out, let's have those conversations. Let's find out what people need. Let's connect them with the resources. There's so many times you hear of, other entities that are volunteering their time or filling gaps with nonprofit work and doing that work. But do you think there's a space where government officially could kind of ever be in that role more robustly?
Yes, I absolutely do. Matter of fact, Sean, I'm a little radical when it comes to that. I believe in planned communities. I believe that there's no excuse for some of the issues that we have in our communities. I'm talking about some of the more underserved and marginalized communities as well. But most communities need help, right? There's no reason why we should not know the needs of the people that are our neighbors. These are our family members. They may not be blood relatives, but these are our family members. These are folks that we have to coexist with in society. So why don't we understand these that the needs of people in community X, and be able to have the check-ins, be able to partner with organizations, and have real accountability with government, nonprofits, faith institutions, and people, so that when if Johnny comes home after being incarcerated, Johnny knows exactly where Johnny needs to go. If Johnny is on the right track, but also wants to go to college, but doesn't think that he, or I'll say Johnetta, she can go to college, then Johnetta needs to know about the free community college program in the state of New Jersey. But the only way she's going to know that is if somebody has told her that. Mm-hmm. So I absolutely believe that there's a space and there are enough dollars to partner. Reva Foster, the chairman of the New Jersey Black Issues Convention, has been talking about neighborhood resource centers for years. And I believe that we should have hubs and centers all around this state to deal with the issues of homelessness, to deal with the issues of small business funding, to deal with the issues of addiction and mental health, to deal with the issues of housing and mortgage financing. I believe that very strongly. And I believe that these communities can be planned. I'm actually talking to folks in Baltimore about this as well. And I've mentioned it to the mayor of Trenton about rebuilding parts of Trenton in this way. For example, Sean, there's something I think that we misunderstand, the word affordability, right? Everyone lives in affordable housing. Everyone does.
Right. Mm-hmm.
Housing you can afford. Mm-hmm. Right? But there is this crazy idea that lower income people should not own. My grandparents were lower income and they owned. They got help. My grandfather got money because he was a veteran. Got help to buy his first home. And why not set up a system where Section 8 payments can go to home mortgages, people buying homes? And NACA has a great program. Neighborhood Assistance Corporation of America have a great program. So I absolutely believe that we should have a robust program that takes government to people around planned communities.
Yeah, no, listen, I mean, I think, oftentimes the best we hear now is oftentimes in elected positions, people trying to opine as to what they think communities need, and they do that through polling or some other method that's not really engaging in a way, even to the depth of a focus group, or certainly not to the depth of knocking on doors and talking to people and having the conversations or talking with other community groups or activists. I don't know. Where do you see that? Like, where's that balance of sometimes there's the kind of top line information. A lot of people rely on polling. I say that because there's a political component to this. When we talk about voting, we talk about all these other things as well. But, do you think that, even in this new world, we saw it with Trump and polling there, that there's just an overemphasis on polling that seems to be missing the mark, specifically in communities of color. And it's at the expense of having those conversations and that direct community outreach that you're mentioning. I guess how do the media relies on polling so much, right? So and often that drives the electeds as to what they want to care about or talk about. So I'm just trying to merge the two of how do you make sure that we're not seeing, polls and things like that miss the mark around, our communities of color. How does that all work together?
Yeah. A lot of people don't understand communities of color and the issues that are important to them. There are many, and communities of color, Sean, are very diverse in needs, in beliefs. So I don't want to box people in and put people in the same box. But what I will say is that oftentimes they get it wrong, because the polling only touches the surface. It doesn't get down to the nitty gritty. Whenever I look at a poll, whenever a pollster that I'm working with, they always give it to me so I can look at the questions. I can read the questions, because sometimes when someone is asking a question and doesn't know how to ask a Black person that question, they will get the wrong answer. Mm-hmm. And if they get the wrong answer to a wrong question, then your numbers are not real. And that's what happens sometimes, right? So what I always say is, and the other thing is, sometimes it's best not to poll Black people over the phone, right? Because it's better to send people out door to door so that folks can see a face that they trust. Also, if you're polling, make sure that the person that's polling can relate to who they're asking the question to. That's also very, very important, because sometimes you'll get a person on the phone and they're like, "Is Derrick Green here?" And they're like, "Nah, nope." Or if, "Oh yeah, this is Derrick, and I want to ask you a few questions." Okay, go ahead. They'll just I'm not answering no questions. I'm not telling you my business. So you have to be careful there. The other thing is that sometimes people don't tell you the truth in the polling. Mm-hmm. We actually saw that in the election of Donald Trump. And there's also a segment of the population that these pollsters don't reach, and they found that with Donald Trump. There's the far right folks that have never voted before it's the weirdest, the most, kind of like Fred Hampton, the leader of the Black Panther Party years ago in Chicago. He would talk about the similarities of the opposites of sides. So you have the far right who are disenchanted with government, right? Then you have also members of the African American and Black and brown communities who are disenchanted with government, but for different reasons. Mm-hmm. It's amazing, and both sides, you can't poll because they're not going to talk to you, and so you have to, as far as Black and brown communities are concerned, you have to find ways to get to the answers, and we found that. We found those ways in my work to get to real answers. about the needs of our people because we go door to door.
Yeah, no, as we talk about the most, genuine and certainly informative way of communicating and talking, which is face to face, door to door, having those conversations, being in the community, transitioning to polling and trying to get that right, at least as you're describing. And it matters who the messenger is, and it certainly matters how it's done and the questions that are asked. And still, even with that, there are challenges. But let's go all the way on the other side of the spectrum, because you alluded to it there, and I think it did play a role in that election, with Donald Trump. And certainly we see it today more than ever. The misinformation, disinformation, specifically on social media, that's another layer to this. And I know you gave, a sermon, thriving in a confused nation, right? And certainly I think we'd all agree a lot of that confusion is because, you're on social media and it's feeding you based on these algorithms, whatever messaging or whatever, path you start to go down, that's it. And certainly the things that people can and do say on social media and the incorrect information that is posted and reposted and retweeted and all the things that happen. How do we cut through that, right? How do we cut through that confusion? Maybe, maybe give us a cheat sheet on where you got to on that conversation, because how do we help in the confusion that exists? I think about it even with our youth, right? Especially in my role as an educator, like how do we help to cut through that? Because if you can't, it really hurts our political process, and quite frankly, hurts our democracy, right? As we're broadly talking about here. But what are your thoughts?
You alluded to a sermon, thriving in a confused nation. There's a formula there, and the first thing you got to do is you have to be bold and stand up against the oppressor. That's the first thing. That sermon, Sean, is about the Hebrew boys who stood up against Nebuchadnezzar when Nebuchadnezzar passed a law, a policy decree that said you have to bow down to this golden image. And if you are the Hebrew boys were taught that you don't bow down to any golden image. You don't bow down to any image. There's only one God. So you give homage to that one God. And so it went against their values. It went against their morals. So they were willing to die to keep their integrity. They were willing to be put in a fiery furnace, as the Bible teaches us. And Nebuchadnezzar actually threw them in the fiery furnace because he wanted them to, at the sound of the trumpet, bow. The trumpet for me is symbolic for the noise. Okay, for the noise, for the social media chatter, for QAnon, for those that say that the election was stolen. We have a big Nebuchadnezzar in Donald Trump. And again, I'm not being partisan, but what I'm being is I'm being vocal and bold to stand up against those who will try to blow a false trumpet, to blow a trumpet of lies, a trumpet of division, a trumpet of untruths, a trumpet of fascism, who will blow those trumpets and expect us to bow down. And what we're finding is that there are people all around this world, Sean, who are like the Hebrew boys, who are willing to stand up. When George Floyd was murdered in broad daylight, that little girl, that teenage girl, taped it, and we would have never known if she had not taped it. She was bold. In this day and age, the formula is you got to be bold. We have to know who we are. The Hebrew boys, Sean, knew who they were. They were confident in who they were. They understood that this is one life, and that even if they died, they would be rewarded. Now, you may not be a Christian to believe in that, but that's what they believed in. And so we have to be bold and stand up against those that will tear down our democracy, those that will speak lies and division and try to destabilize our democracy. That is what's happening now, to destabilize our democracy. Why? Because there are those that want a fascist society. There are those who want America, the power of the presidency to be like Putin, to be like other leaders around the world, and not our beautiful democracy. We are in this country imperfectly perfect. We are imperfectly perfect. And that means that our ideals are perfect, but it can also end up in catastrophe if we do not take it seriously and if we don't preserve this democracy. And we have the ability to do this.
Well, I couldn't say it any better than that. I think you summed it up. You know, both the challenges that we're facing, the courage it takes, and the need to stand up. And quite frankly, which is what I was going to ask you to end with, was just your level of optimism that we're going to be successful there. But I almost heard it in exactly what you were saying there. You know, in that sermon, it is that optimism, right? There are people standing up. There are those who are recognizing the noise and you know, I mean, I guess what is that what gives you hope, you know, for us being successful here? We're facing challenges like we haven't seen in many years, and certainly some new challenges with things that exist now that never have. But, you know, people do keep standing up, and I assume that's what inspires you and gives you hope as well.
Yeah, Sean, you know, the formula that I preach about with thriving in a confused society: know who you are, hold on to your values, hold on strong to your values, don't let it go, and have faith at the end. Right? That's been the formula for America. I am hopeful because I look at slavery, 400 years of people enslaved, but it ended.
Mm-hmm.
It ended. And it ended because good people who believed in humanity, said it's wrong around the world, and it ended. I look at the fact that a war was fought to end it. People will say, oh, Abraham Lincoln, he didn't want to end slavery. He just wanted, I don't care what his motivation was. All I know is that there was something called the Emancipation Proclamation. There's something called the 13th Amendment. And 13th Amendment may be a little flawed, but it freed the slaves. And when I think about the turn of the century, when I think about the establishment of schools, our public school system was established. When I think about the Great Depression and how we came out of the Great Depression, when I think about the great civil rights movement and the strides that were made to give folks civil rights, dignity, to make sure that states could not override your rights to be free. The Civil Rights Act of 1964, the Voting Rights Act of 1965. When I think about Black political power, Black and brown women, the women's movement, and how women have taken on leadership roles throughout the world, presidents of companies and the Me Too movement to protect them in the workplace and other places around society. When I think about Maynard Jackson and Andy Young and Shirley Chisholm and Ken Gibson and Barack Obama, I'm hopeful. I think about the establishment of the Black middle class in this country, home ownership, the lessons around Atlanta and Metro Atlanta and why it's so thriving. And Washington, D.C., Metro Washington, D.C., and Baltimore County, and Prince George's County, and all of that had to do with education and the role of the federal government in contracting, and this push for freedom, Sean. This never-ending struggle that every generation has to carry the torch. It will never end, because the battle between good and evil, right and wrong, will never end until what I am taught, and I'm only going by what I'm taught, until Jesus Christ returns. And don't we have to believe that? That's what I believe. And in this country, we can believe what we want to believe. If you don't believe in God, you have the right to do it. But my point is that every generation, I tell my children this, you have the responsibility to carry the freedom torch. You have the responsibility to speak truth to power. You have the responsibility to understand that injustice anywhere is a threat to justice everywhere. So as I get older, you have to, and I prepared them. They know. Mm-hmm. I was prepared by Dr. Clement Price at Rutgers University. I was prepared by Dr. Emmanuel Saunders at Oakwood University. I was prepared by Ken Gibson and Reverend Reginald Jackson and Christy Davis and Regina Thomas and all these folks that poured into me. Now, each generation, that's why I love the spirit of our youth, because they're not taking it anymore. They don't want to inherit the racism of their parents. And what we have to make sure that they have the tools, Sean, mm-hmm. to be able to take that freedom torch, because as there's always going to be the Trumps, just like there were the Hitlers, the Mussolinis, those that tried to bring in fascism and anti-Semitism and racism. They're going to always be those that come up. You see what's happening in Israel right now, and Gaza, and all these folks fighting. They're going to always be people that try to stifle democracy, Sean. Mm-hmm. But there's always the three boys. There's always the light. All you need is a spark to get that fire going. And we have to take that spark to keep the fire of democracy moving. And we are equipped to do that.
Well, that's hope right there, because knowing that that fight continues, as you said, it always will. But as long as we're providing that spark and education and that knowledge, we're in good hands. Reverend Green, thanks so much for joining today. I really appreciate it. Great conversation, and really great spending some time with you.
Oh, thank you, Sean. Same here, brother.
All right, man. Looking forward to it. Hopefully see you soon.
Same here.